Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Samach Gimel. We're going to continue along the lines of no pun intended, of the lines that we're leaving in our documents. What kind of blank lines can be left, and really the whole concern about forged documents. So I want you to keep in mind this whole idea of how much there's concern for forgeries right nowadays. We know, especially with all sorts of technological advancements, there's always concerns for forged documents. But even in those days, without technological advancements, there was just as much a concern for forgery. What we learned yesterday is that there's a difference between leaving one blank line and two blank lines. That one blank line, there's no concern. And really, they created a situation where there would be no concern, because what they said is, and the Ramban actually explains, and we'll get back to this later today. The Ramban says that it's very hard for witnesses. They're not so expert. They don't do this all the time, witnesses. It's not like there's professional witnesses. And it's very hard for them. I don't know exactly what the difficulty is, but it's hard. Again, this is the Ramban's theory. But the reason why this whole thing about the one line and don't use the last line for anything of importance, it's just a review because we won't let you hold by that last line, is because there's an assumption that it's very hard for the witnesses to sign very close to the text, and that there's going to naturally be a line of space because they're not experts in this. We're going to see later who he does think are experts who actually could put it up against, and therefore the law might be a little different. But that we're going to get to later. So because there's this idea that the Adim, let's just assume for whatever reason, are naturally going to leave a little bit of space. So one line, we're going to let it go, but we're going to make sure there's no forgeries by basically saying nothing in that last line can be of significance, because theoretically someone could have added something in after the witnesses sign. However, two lines, we're not going to let it go because two lines already, there's no reason to leave two lines. Because there's no reason to leave two lines, we're basically going to say, the second to last line could count for something, and therefore there's concern for forgery, so they can't leave two lines. So the beginning of our daf is going to really get into the nitty gritty, exactly what size font, how much space in between the lines, is there space in between the lines or not? So Ibayalehu. Let's start with our question at the bottom of Kuf Samach Bet. I'm a bet at the bottom. Shnei shitin shamru, these two rows that you're saying that they're going back to the braita that said two rows can't be left. Hein va'aviran, two lines and the space in between the lines. Or maybe it just means two lines, meaning however wide a line of text usually is, it's that width of a line with another line just like it, just below, without any space in between them at all. Or maybe with space in between the lines, and then we're going to have to see how much space. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, mistaber dehem v'aviran, de'isal kedat achem v'lo aviran, shita chat v'lo aviran l'may chazia. So he basically says we're going to assume it makes sense to say with space, because if we're talking about two lines without any space, and by the way, it says what can you do with one line without space? But most people take out the word shitachat, because what they really mean is what can you do with two lines without space, right? What two lines without space, you can only really add one line of text, because in between each line, you need some space. So since it's very unlikely you could squeeze in two lines of text into two lines without any space in between them, therefore, it seems like you would need, again, what does it mean you would need? In order for the document to be problematic and for concern for forgery, it would have to be two lines with space. Now, before we get to how much space, how many spaces before, after each line, all that, first we're going to deal with one other issue. Rabbi Shabtai Amal, which is really what we call nowadays the size of the font. Rabbi Shabtai Amal mishmei dechizkiah shnei shitin shamru b'chtav yidei edim v'lo ktav yidei sofer. The sofrim had a certain size that they would write, and the edim would have a different size. So what they're saying is it's not going to be the sofer size, it's going to be the edim size. And why is that? My timer. To call it, it's a pretty good theory. Kolam is a yeah. Anyone who's forging, if they're not going to go to a sofer and get the sofer to write in a line of text, they're going to write it themselves. Now you might say, well, then anytime someone writes themselves, why wouldn't we just say it's forgery? Because that's not true. Imagine we went to a sofer, we got a document written, and then when we go to do the final deal, we realize, oh, you know what? We want to add something. So what's the the way to add it. So one of us will just write it in, or the witness will write it in and then sign their names underneath it. And then it's fine because the witnesses added it, or we added it before the witnesses signed, and that was all good. Our concern here is that they'll add a line after the witnesses signed already, they'll squeeze it in, and it'll be a forgery. So that's why it's, who are we concerned is going to write anything in? Not the sofer. You're not going to go to the sofer and say, can you forge this document for me? Most sofer are going to say, no way, no how, right? This is our job. We have a reputation to live up to. We're not going to forge a document. It's probably just going to be regular person's handwriting and not a sofer, right? What the difference in size is, I don't know. But obviously they knew when they were discussing it. Vikama. Now we get back to the Hein Vaviran. How much space are we leaving? What spaces? Where are we leaving them? And how much? So we're going to have a few different opinions. Right? You would assume, okay, if I would guess, this is what I would have said: a space above, a space between, and a space below, right? Because we have two lines, it would end up being really 5 lines of space. Again, maybe the in-between spaces are a little less than a regular line. Maybe they're the same, right? So it would end up being kind of like 5 lines. But we're going to see some different opinions here. Amar Rav Yitzchak ben Elazar, kigon lecha ze al gabe ze. Now, what's the issue with the word lecha? Lecha has a lamed, which sticks out at the top, and it has a chaf sofi, which sticks out at the bottom. So what they're going to say is you need to have line where you write the word lecha, a space above for the lamed sticking out, so it doesn't jut into the line above, a space below for the chaf sofi jutting out, so it doesn't stick out, it doesn't knock into any letters on the line below. And then if you have lecha on the line below, you also need space on top and space below. Now, think about it. If you did one line with space above and below, and the other line with space above and below, you don't want that lamed to hit the chaf sofi, so you're going to end up with 2 lines in between the 2 rows. So not like I said, 1, 1, and 1, but you're going to have 1, 2, and 1 according to this, because you don't want the chaf and the lamed to hit each other on the in-between 2 lines. So in between the 2 lines, you need 2 rows, actually, of space. So Alma Kasavar, he must hold Shnei Shitim va'arba'a virin. You're going to have 2 lines and 4 spaces, right? This would be much easier if we used 1.15, 1.52, right? It would have been a little easier if they could define like we do with paragraph spacing, line spacing, right? It would be helpful. So they're basically saying, right, they don't tell you how wide the line is. It the same as the other line, how much the avir, this airspace is. But the blank lines, we're going to have 4 blank lines and 2 complete lines, right? 2 lines with letters. Rav Chia bar Abba mishmei de'ula amal, kigon lame milamala v'chaf milamata. Lamed on the top line, so leave some space above the top line. Leave, right, chaf sofit at the bottom line, so leave some space underneath. And then in between the 2 lines, just 1 row, okay? And this is what I said originally. Alma kasavar shnei shitinu shlosha avirin. It's 2 lines with 2, right, with 1 space above, 1 space below, and 1 in between. Rabbi Yavau is the least understandable opinion. It's not even clear what exactly he's saying, because instead of saying 2 rows, which is what we're talking about, he says, Kigon Baruch ben Levi b'shita achat. It's like writing Baruch ben Levi, which has a chaf and a lamed, all in 1 line. Kasaval shita achat v'shnei avirin. Instead of 2 rows, what does he think 2 rows is? He thinks 2 lines is 1 line of text with 2 lines of space above and below. And that's what he calls 2 lines. So either he doesn't think there's aviran, and what he really thinks is just 2 rows, or he thinks hein va'aviran is included in the 2 rows. It's a little unclear exactly what his opinion is, like where he gets it from, and whether he disagrees that you need space in between the lines, and this is just his way of saying 2 lines, or he thinks it's space, but he really thinks 1 line in space is like 2 lines, okay? As long as you have a space above and a space below, that already, what he thinks is you can basically squeeze in 2 lines of text to a text like that. That was part 1 of today's daf, which is dealing with these 2 rows the 2 lines that we're talking about. Number 1, is there space in between? Number 2, what size font are we talking about? And if there's space in between, how much space? How many? 3 lines, 4, right? 3 of space, 4 of space, right? Not so clear. Or maybe 1 line with space above and below is all you need. Now we're going to, from now till the end of the daf, we're going to discuss a machlok at Rav and Rabbi Yochanan about ashrata de dayana. Now, the ashrata of the dayanim, we've talked about this before. We've learned many times about kiyum shtarot. You have a document that's signed by two witnesses, which, by the way, brings me to Alana Steinhain's Shiur this week is going to go up later today. And it's about what we learned in yesterday's stuff about the if we cancel one witness, right, and why it's different in a shtar than in legal situations. Like if two witnesses come and say we witnessed a murder, one is no good, we're not going to accept, right? The other one is going to be disqualified entirely, even if there were three and we're left with two. Okay, why the difference? What we discussed yesterday, right? She actually titled it the domino effect and how one is canceled, all the rest are canceled. But here we said not necessarily. But what we've learned is that once you establish, right, we have witnesses signed on a document, which again, that's why I brought this up with Alana, because the different why is witnesses signed on a document has a certain amount of validity that might be different from witnesses coming into court. There's a bit of a difference with that. Anyway, witnesses sign a document. It's not enough that they just signed. We have to verify their signatures. And we go through a process where they go, the court checks the signatures. They have all different methods of figuring that out. Once they verify the signatures, they sign on the bottom of the document. So it's kind of like, you sign a document and then the lawyer signs under you, verifying that all the facts are correct. It's like that. So like a notarization. So it's probably the most similar to what we know of as a notarization. And they basically say, we verify that this document is valid. Now the whole question is, what about space being left there? How is it different? Now, both Rav and Rabbi Yochanan think it's different from space being left above the witnesses' signatures. The question is, in which direction and why? And what we're going to have is the Gemara is going to give their opinion and then start raising all sorts of questions. But couldn't you forge a document this way? And couldn't you forge it that way? And how do we avoid that? So I'm a Rav. Lo shanu ella. Now, lo shanu ella is always going back to some Tanaitic source, because shana milashon lishnot, which Tana is also Shana, Taf and Shin switch. So it's going back to the braita that said 2 lines is a problem. Lo shanu ella. This 2 line being a problem is only, so it means lo shanu ella. It is not taught except for bein edim l'chtav, between the witnesses and what was written. Aval bein edim la'ashalta, from the edim to this ashalta, to this ashrata, afilu tuvanami kashil. You can have You can have 2 lines. Doesn't matter. We don't care if there's space. We're not worried that in between the witnesses' signatures and the judge's stamp of approval, we don't mind, and the judge's signatures, we don't mind if there's space. Doesn't concern us. Now, good point about the notary. Thank you, Terry, about how a notary is specifically, it's saying the witness is signed in front of us. This is different because this is just validating. I think that what I was really meant to say is that it's the result of it is the same, where it's saying this document is valid now. Okay, it gives a certain validation to the validity to the document. So now the Gemara asks, "Ma'ishna bein edim l'chtav." Right? What's the difference between edim l'chtav? This is a question. Between edim and the text, really mean the text and the witnesses, right? Because the witnesses come after. Dilma, we can't leave 2 lines because Dilma mezayif bekata my debai v'chatim esade. This is just review, right? They might add in text that wasn't there after the witness is signed, and it'll look like the witness is signed, and it wasn't true. Bein edim la'ashalta nani mezayif bekata my debai v'chatim esade. Between the witnesses and this ashalta, also theoretically, one could add a text and whatever they want. And it looks like the Edim signed on it because the Edim are signed on this document and the Dayanim are basically signing underneath saying all this is good. So why aren't we concerned with that? And in fact, the Gemara thinks you're right. We are concerned about that. So the only way this could work, what Rav is saying, is if to mitayetly. It must be. Now, what this means exactly is a source of debate. They added something in between. In other words, you can leave more than 2 lines as long as either, according to the Rashbam, you smear it with ink. So it's got ink all over it so that nothing can be written there. And then you can leave space, just make sure to blot it out with ink. Some people think it means like you put dots across or lines, like in a check where you make a line so that no one can write anything, something like that, where you basically make it impossible for anybody to add anything or seemingly impossible. We're going to see. It's still possibly possible, and that's going to be the next question. So now they're going to say, Amre, Ihachi, if you can do this litayet, as they call it, adding ink, well, bein edim l'shtar nami mitayet. Why didn't we say that above? Why didn't we say with the witnesses that you can leave some space, just blot it out with ink? Same thing. So Amre, and this is going to be the whole back and forth. Every time we say for one, it's not a problem. Why is it a problem then for the other? Okay. It's like a ping pong. Amre sadeh tiyutahu dechatime. Now, when it's witnesses, if witnesses sign over us at the end, right, we're going to have text, then a section that's blotted out and the witnesses' signatures. Perhaps the witnesses are signing specifically on the ink blot and saying, yes, this is legitimately blotted out. Because, you could think something was blotted out. Maybe someone didn't want it to be in there. And maybe they were signing only for that. Okay. So obviously we're going to ask now, Beitina. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Right. So they're going to worry about that. So then they say, okay, why aren't we concerned also that the Dayanim are only signing on the ink blot? Beidina atiutahu dechatime, right? Why don't we say that the Beit Din is only signing on the tiuta? So the answer is Beidina atiute lo chatime. No, when the judges and a witness can sign on a document and sign just on an ink blot and say, right, the same way if you mess up a check, you sign right next to your mess up to show that. To the Eidim, if they're signing right after the ink blot, it could be very logical that the Eidim just sign right there. But with the Beit Din, with the judges don't sign on just what's above. When judges come to give their stamp of approval to a document, they're giving a stamp of approval to the entire document. They're saying everything in this document is valid. Whereas witnesses could be signing on something in particular, could be signing on the whole document. And that's why this is not a concern. So far, we seem to have resolved why there's a difference, because if you ink blot something out by witnesses, you might think they're signing only on that. And then the rest of the document, you wouldn't be able to follow because maybe the witnesses weren't signing on that. But if judges have an ink blot before them and the rest of the document above, we're not concerned for any sort of forgery because no one can fill in anything above there. And there's no miscommunication here that people will think it's just on that. It'll be obvious they did that. However, we're still worried. There's another concern. Well, if we have judges here that say, oh, everything above is valid. Okay, well, what if they cut after the witnesses' signatures and they cut off the whole document that the judges validated? They take the document that's ink blotted out. We now have we have a piece of a document with ink blotted out stuff and judges' signatures saying everything above is valid. Now, what if you take that, you erase the ink blot, you write a whole document, right? Okay, you could write in one line, so-and-so owes so-and-so, you forge some signatures, and now you have dayanim that say everything above is valid, and people will validate this document. That's a problem. And Amar Rav, now you might say, you can't write on an ink blot, but Amar Rav, shtar haba huva edav alamacha kashil. If you have a shtar that's completely erased, which is what our document is, other than the dayanim signatures, it's erased and rewritten over. It was obvious that they could tell if something was erased. We've seen this before. Now, if you basically erase the text, wrote out a document on it, and the agent sign on that erased part, well, it's valid. Now, you might say, but you have to go validate the signatures, but you won't because the judges are signed at the bottom. So it's obvious it's a good document to the naked eye. Someone will see it. They'll say, oh, look, looks like a good document. That's Rav. Now, I just want you to remember who's who. Rav said in the beginning, he was the one who said, Lo shanu ela bein edim l'chtab edim lashrata, or asharta, even more, right? You can leave a lot of space. It's fine. But Rav also says that you can erase, sign, right? You can have a text with text, witnesses signed, and it would be valid. So then you're going to be stuck here because if judges signed at the bottom of this document, people are going to think this is a fair and square document. And really, someone could have cut taken that ink blot, right? The ink blot doesn't really help us, basically. So turning out on the bet, we're going to have two tracks here. And it really has to depends on who is the author of that last line that we just said about writing on the machak is kasher. So Hani Chalarav Kahana Dematne Labishme de Shmuel Shapir. The whole problem was that Rav contradicted himself because, Rav doesn't make any sense if he's consistent with what he said elsewhere. If you can sign on an erased ink, if you can basically, you can have witnesses who the text of the document and the witnesses signed over this erased area, the document will be valid, then this doesn't make sense because this could totally lead to a forgery because you now have judges verifying this document that looks good to everybody and it's really not. So if you hold like Rav Kahana, who said that Shmuel was the one who said the statement about you can erase a document and have, if the text and the witnesses is over the erasure, it works. Shmuel's the one who says it and not Rav. And Rav actually doesn't allow for that. And since Rav doesn't allow for that, there's no problem here at all. That's an easy track. But Ela Rav Tavyumi Tamane Labishmei de Rav, but Rav Tavyumi says that Rav was the one who actually said that statement, as we saw in Amud Aleph. So my Ikala Memar, how can you explain this? So now we're stuck. Because in the end, there is a concern. If you leave, again, let's just go back to summarize, because we're now going to get to the end of Rav. Rav holds no problem with Hashrata to leave space, even though we said someone could add a whole document there. No, it's ink, or someone could add things, right? Someone could add extra words that weren't signed by the witnesses and we think it was valid. Oh no, we ink blot out the area, either put dots, lines, cover the whole thing with ink and no one can write anything. Maybe they can erase, right? Cut, erase, write over it, and that would be accepted according to Rav. So now it leads to a forgery. Well, you'd have to say the following. Kasavar, Rav must hold, because otherwise really there would be a forgery. Kol ki gavna. Now, any kind of situation like this, meaning if you're in a court and they bring the document that has the stamp of the Beit Din, but the whole section above, the whole document, was written over an erasure, the whole thing was erased and rewritten. So in that kind of case, in that case, you wouldn't accept that just, by looking at it. You wouldn't say, oh, this is a document that the judge has already verified. You would have to re-verify the signatures of the witnesses because we're worried about a forgery. So in the end, they can't really explain fully why Rav is not concerned for a forgery. And they end up saying there is one, and that's, we resolved a bunch of the possibilities of forgery. We're not worried about that because they fill it in with the ink. We're not worried about that. Okay, we resolved all of them except for one. There is this concern, if you hold that Rav held that you can write on over an erasure, then ink blotting doesn't fully help you. So in the event, so now if a regular document comes to our attention with the ink blot, right, the section ink blotted out, that would all be fine. But if there was something that you could tell it was erased and written over, and the whole document is erased, written over, or a chunk of the document before the witness's signatures is erased, written over, and the signature and witnesses signed there, even though that's an acceptable document in court, we won't accept the ratification of the judges in that case. We'll have to reassess the witnesses' signatures just to make sure that nobody cut this off from a bigger document, that the witnesses, that there were different witnesses signed, and it was a different document that was verified and not this one. So that resolves our problem. Now, the structure with this next opinion is going to be very much the same thing. And again, we're going to end up with, there really is concern for forgery, and therefore, if a situation like that would come to your attention, you would have to do something else as well, okay? So it's a very, very similar structure, except that Rabbi Yochanan has the exact opposite opinion of Rav. Rav thinks that it's much easier to leave space between the witnesses and an ashrata. Comes Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, Rabbi Yochanan amar lo shanu ela bein ha'edim lachtav. This whole thing, okay, says the same thing. This two-line thing is just witnesses and the text above them. Aval bein edim la'asharta afilu shita achat pasul. He goes the opposite direction. He says no space is allowed to be left between the judges and the text. The judges have to be right below the witnesses' signatures. Now, if we go back to the Ramban, this is where he really says his difference here, which is witnesses are not used to signing. And again, I'm not exactly sure why this would be, but he claims that they have difficulty signing right up against the text. It's harder for them. That's why we're going to leave this one line of space, and that's why the one line is not going to have anything of importance because maybe it was forged, because naturally they're going to often not be able to sign right close up to the text. But judges who sign documents all the time are professionals. They know how to put it right near the text, and therefore no space is allowed because the assumption is they can do it, and therefore we're going to require them to sign right near. Again, that's the Ramban. I'm not saying everybody agrees with that, but it's one possible explanation as to why there would be this distinction. And there's a distinction also because it's maybe more necessary, less necessary, but it's also the idea that why can't we force the Eidim also not to leave any space and forget this whole law about Shita Achrona and don't count from the last line anything, don't take it seriously, right? Don't act upon it. Anyway, okay, so that's the Ramban's explanation. But anyway, let's go back to our text. So now the Gemara is going to say, Ma'ishna bein Eidim la'ashchata. What's the difference between them? Dilma, they're going to say now, this is the difference. Dilma guys li'ilai, v'katav hu ve'edav b'shita achat. Because if you leave one line, what could you do? Someone could cut off from the Eidim signatures, right? Cut off the witnesses' signatures entirely. What are you left with? One line. What can you do with one line? Actually, you could do a lot with one line. And we're going to see, I'm just going to read one more thing, but maybe I'll just translate. You could say that what could happen with that one line? You could write a text like, you owe me money, okay? And then sign witnesses at the end of that row, all in one line, and fake a document. If you leave one line before the Eidim signature, before the judge's signatures, that leaves a total, a possibility for an entirely forged document. They'll cut the witnesses, they have this stamp of approval of the court, and they'll add a line with two signatures, and that would be fine. Now, why would that be fine? Well, kasavar, it must be that Rabbi Yochanan holds shtar habahu ve'edav b'shita achat kasher. He must hold that it's a kosher document if you have one line of text, and on that same line, you have the witnesses' signatures. Now, why is that worse than, right, with the witnesses, we said you can't leave one line because one line with witnesses' signatures underneath doesn't work. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that there we're worried if you have witnesses' signatures underneath, right? Let's say justified, right justified, let's just say, right? Everything's right justified. And you have a line, then it's possible that someone just left this space, right? And cut the top, added the line, and the line is a forgery. But you're never going to have witnesses signed at the end of a row with a blank row in front. They're always going to right justify or left justify, depending on your Hebrew, English, whatever it is. But it's going to be justified to the side. No one's going to sign in the middle of a row and leave a blank line. Nobody does that. So therefore, if it's in the middle of a line, these signatures, and there's text before it, we're going to assume if it's all in one row, that must be, it was written like that and signed like that. And the witnesses must have signed on the text that was written before it. That just makes logical sense. So therefore, again, this, you have to remember, Rabbi Yochanan said this. The Gemara is now discussing why is he not worried about a forgery? And then they're, I say making up, but they're trying to fill in the blank. They say he must hold this because if he didn't hold that, for sure we'd be concerned for a forgery with that, right? With this, it must be, his concern is that leaving one line of space could lead to an entirely forged document because everything could be fit in that one line. And it must be then, he must hold that everything fitting in one line is actually kosher and it would be a good shtar. Ihachi, but wait, if that's the case, if it all could be in one line, so bein Eidim l'chtav nami. Now, I already explained this to you, but if everything could be in one line, then why aren't we worried about the witness, the lines before the witnesses? If it could all be in one line, why aren't we worried that someone cuts off, adds a line, right? Dilma guys leili Eli, maybe they'll cut off the top, cut of my debai, they'll write what they want, and chatime sadeh, and the witnesses they were assigned. So again, this is what I explained just before. On one line, it's all fine. You could have text and witnesses all on one line, and that's the whole problem with the ashrata and the space before it. But witnesses, if you have text, witness, witness, right? One line of text, witness, witness, that's a problem. And that was the whole thing because we assume Eidim leave a blank space. Because Eidim leave a blank line because they're not capable of signing up or it's just typically what's done. Therefore, we're worried someone can cut it and we're not going to accept a document that has one line of text with two lines underneath, again, all justified, so the same side, that could definitely be a forgery. So that explains what I already explained, kind of why it would be a difference. But the Gemara is not satisfied yet. What if we go back to that witness case? You have an empty line, which is always there, let's say, or mostly there. They cut off the top. They take that one line, and what do? They have so-and-so owes so-and-so money, and then they sign two witnesses at the end of the line. Now, we just said if you do that, it's good. Now, you still have two witnesses below. So what do you say? Well, the Amar, Ana lirabot be'edim hu davide. And you just say, oh, yeah, those were just extra witnesses. I just added some extra witnesses, but the real witnesses, right, like it's all on this line. And this line, right, so now you have a document that has one line, two witnesses on the same line, which we said is good, right? And okay, you also have two witnesses below, but you could say those aren't really significant. It's really that whole line. And we just said a document like that would be accepted. So why aren't we concerned for a forgery there? Hasaval, he must hold. And here we're going to end like we did with Rav. If you were a judge and this came to your desk and you had a document that had, now again, remember, Rabbi Yochanan holds, and that's the whole reason why he didn't allow this line in the Ashrata, that if you have a document with text and witnesses on that same line, both witnesses on the same line, that's a good document. But if it comes to you with all in one line and then two witnesses below, and the person claims, oh yeah, those were just additional, they were just, added for effect, for, I wanted to respect some people and give them the opportunity to sign my document, but they're not really, right? Then what does the judge have to do? If the judge wants to validate this document, they don't look at the two witnesses below because maybe someone added that whole row and these witnesses didn't sign this document. Maybe it was cut off with those witnesses signed. Because if we went and validated those signatures, right? Those signatures didn't sign on this line. That was, right, remember, they cut the document. Those signatures were signing on information that is gone now. So if we validate those signatures and say, oh, yeah, this is definitely that person, this is definitely that person, valid signature, and then validate this one line, we could possibly be validating a forgery. So if a case comes to us, it's just like we ended with Reb. If it came to you, right, in that case, it was, if it came to you, and now I have to remember the case, right, if it was people signed over an erasure, right, the whole document, both the text and the witnesses are signed over a section that's erased and there's dayanim at the bottom, we ignore the dayanim, we have to re-ratify that document because of the forgery. Also here, there is a possible forgery case, which is if it's all in one row, and in addition, there's two witnesses below, we have to validate those ones on the row because of this concern that maybe that row was again, cut off from a bigger document. The empty row was now filled in with what looks like a completely valid document. Well, unless you can verify those signatures, it could be those are forged signatures and it's not really legit. So that is today's daf. Basically, we're going to stop here because the last line is just a gufa. It just means we're going to go back in depth into this line we already said, which is Amarav Shtar Habahu Be'edav Alamacha Kasher. This thing we quoted in the name of Rav, but maybe it was Shmuel who said, if you have a star with Adim and everything was over a section that was erased, it's okay. So we'll get back to that tomorrow and we'll go more in depth. So what we did today, we dealt with how much space do you need? Is it just two lines? Is it two lines with space above and below? How much space above and below, if so? And what size font are we talking about? The rows are, and obviously it's the witnesses and not the sofer, because the sofer wouldn't be the one writing a forged document. And then we have Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, who have a big debate about this when the ratification of the judges appears at the bottom. Can we have more space? Because we're not worried about anything there. We're not worried that someone could add in text at the end, even though theoretically we actually are, so it must be ink blotted, and we dealt with all that. And we have Rabbi Yochanan who said you can't leave anything because theoretically they could cut the whole top and fill in a full complete document right above because he thinks that one line of document and witnesses would be valid. And therefore he doesn't allow for anything. And then we had to say, then why does he allow for it in the Adim? Because we said if a case like that comes to our hands where there's whole line with witnesses and there's two witnesses below, we are worried for a forgery, and the only way to resolve it is to check for the witnesses. So in the end, even though they seem to be saying in this case there's concern for forgery, in this case there isn't, differentiating between two different cases, in the end, we still seem to find possibilities of forgery. Some are resolved and others are resolved in a way of, well, you would have to actually be a little more careful if a case like that came to you with exactly those details, either written over erasure or adim sign below a line that has also adim sign. So you would have to take certain actions to make sure that that document wasn't actually a forgery and kind of re-establish the document in a different way to avoid forgeries. So like I said, things that we deal with all the time now about forgeries, and it seems that in those days there was also lots of concern for forged documents and what precautions were taken to ensure that documents could be, no one would really take advantage. So we'll continue along this, moving on to tomorrow's stuff tomorrow, and have a great day, everybody.